second subject. During the development section, which was not a real development section, but a sort of a free fantasia, there was a very impassionate recitativo melody by the clarinet over a tremolo of strings, which probably was influenced by a very similar place, the first movement of the F minor piano concerto by Chopin. And it was something like this.
Very impassioned work for a boy. When did you write it? When you were 10?
Yes.
9 or 10?
Of course, it's very difficult to say whether I wrote it, I rewrote it, I suppose. But after all composers started under some influence. And I can claim for myself the sort of attenuating circumstance that I gave up composing very soon.
Now, in 1908, or thereabouts when you were 11, I think you came to England to do 4 concerts. And there's a famous cutting from the Daily Mail where you were described as the new Mozart.
Oh, yes. People do make mistakes.
What sort of recollections have you of this journey? I mean, it must have been a great adventure for you to come all the way from Vienna to London.
Oh, yes. Well, I had been playing before, not only in Vienna, at a concert which was my debut, as it were, but before coming to London, I had been playing in Dresden at a special concert which was conducted by the famous Ernst von Schuch at the Dresden Royal Opera, where incidentally before the concert, after the rehearsal, some music critics were invited to test me whether this was a complete swindle and sham or whether there was something to this boy, and they gave me a theme to improvise and so forth and so on. So London was actually the continuation of this journey. Of course, it was very, very exciting and in many ways unforgettable.
What can you remember about it? I mean, seeing London through the eyes of a boy at that age.
Well, I remember, for instance, and I don't know whether it is a good taste to name the name, but one of the big department stores, I don't know whether you call them department stores.
Yes, we do.
Here as well, I won't mention it. It's a very well-known department store where I saw all sorts of things and toys I hadn't seen before. Then I remember that at one concert, I think it was in the Albert Hall, when the orchestra played an overture I had composed, I was required to sit like a dummy at the piano for exhibition purposes, I suppose, because there was no piano obbligato in the piece, and I didn't know what to do.
Now, soon after that, or fairly soon after that, you went to Leipzig for a time to study with Max Reger.
Yes.
Did you know his music before you went there?
Yes, I did know his music because my teacher, Robert, thought very highly of him and also had his pupils play some of Reger's piano music.
Did you think highly of it too?
I was very much impressed. I was not very warmly attracted by it. I tended more towards Strauss, but I had to admire the wonderful workmanship. These 3 months at the class of Reger these were not terribly productive for me. I was the youngest in the class, and it was at that time his habit to tell the filthiest stories to his students. And I had always to leave the room, Besides, his way of teaching was very summary. When I came for the first time to his class, he said, well, this is Tuesday, next class is Friday. Until then, write 30 minuets and 15 chorales for me. Well, of course, I couldn't, and I came in and had half a minuet and 1 chorale or something like that. It was a very curious time in his life when he didn't take teaching too seriously. However, I remember one experience which has remained unforgettable. That was his class in analysis. And I remember in particular the Bruckner 8th Symphony he analyzed. This was quite an experience. Very, very profound, very imaginative, not simply dissecting. He was a huge, uncouth-looking man. If memory serves, or maybe just because I was at that time a little boy, he must have been something like 6'5" or so. Very fat and actually rather vulgar in his way of expressing himself, throwing around four-letter words with glee. And when he went to the piano, you heard the most velvety touch and the greatest delicacy in the treatment of the instrument I've ever experienced.
And as a boy, you doubtless found it difficult to reconcile these two sides of Max Reger.
Yes, it was a little odd, I must say.
Now, had you any idea at that stage of the direction in which you would eventually go? Had you an idea that you really were going to be a professional pianist, or as you were composing, did you see yourself possibly in the end as a composer, or had you already got an idea of being a conductor?
I don't know that at that age the decision had been made. I was simply following the precept of my parents and of my teachers to become an all-round musician. I kept on taking engagements as a pianist, and I kept on writing music. But I was always so interested in the orchestra that probably very soon afterwards, I would say around the age of 12 or 13, it was pretty clear that eventually I would become a conductor. This decision was made a little easier by the fact that as a pianist you have to practice for hours and hours every day. And frankly, I was a little too lazy to do that. I was a very brilliant pianist at that time and liked to tell the story when they asked me, why did you give up piano playing? I said, you see, when I was about 12 or 13, the three greatest living pianists got together and decided to pay me a lifelong retainer for the promise not to remain a concertizing pianist.
When did you first meet Richard Strauss?
I met Strauss after I had joined the Berlin State Opera, then Royal Opera, as répétiteur. He didn't actually engage me. The man who engaged me was his second in command, Leo Blech, a very versatile and very knowledgeable, eminently practical conductor, whose most economic rehearsing technique I have admired and adopted. He really did his homework beautifully. He met me in Vienna at a house of mutual friends. Excuse me, and I played for him. And he knew I wanted to become a conductor. And at that time, it was the standard way to become a conductor, to join an opera house as last miniature wheel in the machinery. And when I actually was already in service at the opera, Strauss met me and sort of took the protectorate away from Leo Blech, which Leo Blech did not accept with too much good grace. But by that time, Strauss had attracted me, and he apparently found pleasure in using me and in my talent.
But did you not, somewhere around that time, actually deputize, this time for Strauss himself, at a very early gramophone recording session?
Yes, this is a very funny occurrence. There was a session of his Don Juan scheduled, and it was very early in the morning. It was a terribly unpleasant November morning in Berlin, and Strauss had instructed me to go there and rehearse the orchestra so he can sleep an hour longer and then take over. So I went there and rehearsed the orchestra for the first. You don't have to tell you, of all persons, that at that time pieces were split up into 4 minute or 4 minutes and 2 seconds or so spots. And Don Juan was a 16-minute piece, therefore 4 parts. I rehearsed the first part and then the second part, and things. Incidentally, I rehearsed it from memory. I had played it on the piano. That was my hobby, to play scores on the piano. And everybody was quite pleased. And by that time, of course, some time had elapsed, and the producer got nervous, as producers get if they feel that they are squandering money for the orchestra, and said, Dr. Strauss isn't here yet, you have to conduct the first take. And I said, but excuse me, how can I conduct first take? And never mind that, we have to use the services of the orchestra, please go up and conduct. So I conducted the first 4 minutes, no Strauss visible. Then I was forced to conduct the second 4 minutes. And after having finished those, I turned around and saw Strauss, who had just arrived in his big fur coat, grinning all over his face and saying something which I might translate into, well, in this case, one can cheerfully bite the dust if one sees such a young generation coming along. And directed that these two first parts were plenty good enough to go out under his name. He didn't care to repeat them. So the very first record of Don Juan, if it is still available somewhere, which was made in, I think, 16, it must have been November 16, were conducted by me, the first two sides, under his name.
Would it be true to say, in a way, that he sort of launched you on your career?
Yes, it is not only true, but it is decisively true. He launched me on my career in 1917, when the first conductors, the leading conductor's post at the Municipal Theater in Strasbourg became free through Otto Klemperer's moving to Cologne.
What about Strauss as a conductor?
There were two Strausses as a conductor. The one who was interested and the one who was not interested. You could experience him by turns, as it were. I shall never forget a performance of Fidelio at the Berlin State Opera. At that time, he had a contract for a given number of performances to be absolved in a given period of time, as short as possible, for which he came to Berlin from Garmisch, where he had his house where he composed. And very often, you had the feeling that he was just serving time or earning his fee and waiting for the card game that came after the performance. So sometimes it would be like this. He would be terribly bored, and in the finale of Fidelio, Beethoven, with his da-da-di-da-dim, da-da-di-da-dim, ba-da-di-da-dim, da-da-di-da-dim, looking at the watch, and now pushing the tempo. It was already late, and his three partners for skat, the popular German card game, were already waiting. On the other hand, if he prepared a production of a Mozart opera, or if he went down and improvised and was in the mood, a performance of Valkyrie or Tristan, it could really be most exciting. Curiously enough, he gave short shrift to his own works. It sometimes, or rather very often, seems that his real interest was exhausted by the time he had put down the last note. And yet, sometimes, I remember in particular one performance of Elektra, which was hair-raising. That was in Vienna later on. So he could be very uneven. And in concert, he could also be inspiring and very uneven. Some of his performances would strike you as very odd. The other day, I happened to hear over the radio an old record of Beethoven's Fifth he made in the 20s, which evoked very curious memories in me, with all sorts of tempo shifts and abrupt changes and sloppy playing and even sloppy interpreting, for which actually he was attacked at that time too. And then on other occasions he could be wonderful.
He was a great conductor, I believe, of Wagner and Mozart.
I have yet to hear a performance of Così fan tutte that would strike me as much as a Strauss performance of Così fan tutte on a blessed day.
Well, in 1924, when you were 27, you went to Berlin as chief conductor of the Berlin State Opera. Now, in Berlin at that time, there were, in fact, 2 other opera houses.
Yes.
And during your 6 or 7 years there, the other houses were, in fact, being run, so to speak, musically by Otto Klemperer and Bruno Walter.
I was not running the Staatsoper Unter den Linden. It was actually Kleiber who ran it, and I was second in command.
It must have been a pretty remarkable situation to have conductors of the caliber of Kleiber and Klemperer and Bruno Walter and yourself all in one city at the time.
It was fascinating.
What memories have you of a particularly grand performance or a particularly special occasion from those
Well,
days?
of course, you know that the first performance of Vortech in those years has become a historical date. Then many performances that Klemperer did in the Kroll Opera were most interesting. The first performance of Cardiac by Hindemith, performances of Stravinsky ballets and so forth, many other things. Walter, on the other hand, did very interesting productions of a more conservative repertoire out in Charlottenburg, where the Städtische Oper, the municipal opera, was located. It was a wild and very competitive and very exciting time.
Was your own repertoire at that time pretty conservative, or were you...
Yes, it was pretty conservative on the whole, but I also did a few new operas. I did, for instance, the first performance of Korngold's Die Tote Stadt, which at that time was one of the successful contemporary operas. I did the first performance of Boris Godunov in Berlin at the State Opera, very late.
In the Rimsky version, was this?
Of course, in the Rimsky version. The other one was hardly talked about. It was known that it existed. And later on, I did the first performance in Berlin of Strauss's Intermezzo, so forth and so on. But by and large, the repertoire was a conservative one. I remember I was hauled, as it were, in the middle of a season from Düsseldorf, where I was the chief conductor, into my new position in Berlin. And I shall never forget that this first week I had to conduct, without a single rehearsal, the complete Ring plus Salome.
In 1 week?
In 1 week, yes.
Now, after that, you went to the German Opera House in Prague.
Yes.
Now, while you were in Prague, one of the things that happened is that you made a very, very famous gramophone record.
Yes.
A record which has now been around for something like 30 years, or in fact longer than 30 years. And that's the Vortech Cello Concerto
with Casals, yes. I can hardly resist to make one comment on this record, because it is so grotesque after so many people have made so much money on that record. Would you guess what I was paid for this record?
Well, one supposes very handsomely, of course.
No, not really. You, having been in that business so long, can mean this only facetiously, but you wouldn't really guess how little I was paid. I was paid a flat fee. It was about, there were 5 sessions, I think. I was paid a flat fee of £50, if you please, for the whole thing.
It must irritate you somewhat to see that record in shops when you're walking around in London or Paris.
Well, not particularly that, but I have tried to take my revenge on the recording companies in my own small way. Not very successfully, but I'm always trying.
The sort of the high point of your career was the decision in 1946 to go to Cleveland and settle down there.
Yes.
And accept this great challenge. When you took that post, what was your real object? You had a good orchestra at your disposal already, I mean Cleveland,
yes.
But it was not, shall we say, a first-class orchestra then. What were you setting out to do?
I set out to build an orchestra which would combine the best qualities of the fine European orchestras, pre-war period, even pre-First World War period, with the finest qualities of the American orchestras in their best period. That is the impeccable intonation, the impeccable virtuosity, the brilliance, the smoothness of execution, which very often in America was an end in itself. And these qualities I wanted as the premise on which to build, as the precondition, and I wanted to combine this with the spontaneity, the warmth, the flexibility of the best European orchestras and the tradition consciousness and the familiarity with the good musical habits, let's say, the musical virtues of the best European orchestras during their best period. That was in a
that was the ideal.
That was the ideal, with particular emphasis on ensemble playing to the point of chamber musical feeling of each other while playing, not just simply playing notes following a stick, but for the individual member not to play his part only, but play the whole piece and be in it, even if his part shows 40 bars of rest.
Did you realize, you must have realized what a long task this was going to be, that no matter what conditions were given to you, this could not be achieved in, well, how long did you think it would take you to build the instrument?
I actually must say that I did not apply or have enough foresight to calculate this development in terms of years and months. I knew the old saying that it takes decades to build up a good orchestra and a fortnight to ruin it. You have heard that before. So I had no exaggerated expectations of speedy bloom.
But if I may say so rather typically, I think you must have absolutely insisted on the conditions that you wanted. You would not have undertaken it otherwise, would you?
Absolutely not. My negotiating position was the strongest imaginable because I didn't have to make a change and I did not need it. So I dictated my own terms, even to the point that I said, I will not talk to you unless at the predetermined day when you want me to come to Cleveland, your president and your two leading vice presidents are negotiating with me. The manager may sit in, but I'm not negotiating with the manager who has to go back and to ask whether this or that is acceptable. And I shall have 3 sets of conditions. The first set will be an absolute condition, a set of absolute conditions. And if I hear one no, or perhaps to that, I walk out and take the next train out. The second set is subject to limitations of what you can do financially. The third set will be in the form of urgent requests. And so even the mode of negotiation was already dictated by me.
You had a fair amount of opposition and scandal, I imagine, in Cleveland in those first years.
Not really much scandal, but a fair amount of opposition would be correct to say. On the other hand, when I took over Cleveland, this American method of running orchestras was still the standard method. When Rodzinski took over the New York Philharmonic in 1943, he sacked 30 members. Of course, that was a scandal, but he was entitled to do it. And if his hide was thick enough, he could do it, and all of a sudden he had a much better orchestra.
How many did you sack?
I didn't sack many. You see, the Cleveland Orchestra was financially always very well endowed, so I could proceed with due regard to certain human considerations and could do it in a milder way. But there were, of course, moments of heartbreak and moments of unpleasantness. But then of course, you arrive very soon at the point, and this point is now very much at discussion. What is the purpose of a symphony orchestra for which so many people give, without compensation, their time? I'm now talking about the board, and collect money. That's the way American orchestras are being run, as you know. There's no state or public money, just private money. What is the purpose? Is it the purpose of the symphony orchestra to make it possible to have the best of music, or is it the purpose of such an orchestra to give their members the easiest and unchallengeably permanent job?
As you know, in London here we have, well, at a reasonable estimate, 5 orchestras.
I am very well aware of the fact, and I hope you won't ask me to make any comment on this state of affairs.
Well, I would like you to make a comment on it, but...
well, the comment is so obvious and has been made by London musicians themselves and even by members of the London orchestras that it is hardly necessary for me to repeat it. But if you wish, I would say that if vested interests and local conditions weren't against it, the merger of 2 and 2 orchestras could give you, I think, much finer orchestras, and at the same time, I think the individual players much better basis of professional existence without their having to scurrying around from one job to the other.
Dr. Szell, in 1947, you walked out of the Glyndebourne Festival, or the Glyndebourne Opera, where you'd been invited to conduct. What happened?
There was such a casual kind of preparation of this first post-war reappearance of Glyndebourne plus Edinburgh Festival that it was completely impossible for me to continue. Nothing actually had been properly prepared. If I tell you that the singer who was supposed to sing Susanna had never sang the part before and arrived without knowing it about 2 or 3 weeks before the first performance, that might illustrate things. There were wonderful rehearsals on paper, but the participants weren't all there, and so on and so forth. So I had no choice but to walk out.
Well, you've acquired quite a reputation, if I may say so, over the last 20 years for walking out of places, especially opera houses, because, in fact, you did it again at the Metropolitan on the famous occasion of Tannhäuser.
Yes, and with the same general manager, as a matter of fact.
And for the same reasons?
No, the reasons were not identical, but slightly similar. Also, lack of responsibility in attention to essentials, as I find them, as I feel them.
What are those essentials?
Well, for instance, if at a performance of Tannhäuser, in the first open change of scenery, an iron rod comes down so that it almost hits the Tannhäuser on the head, and you discover that this is due to the fact that the director of the stage machinery had his day off and his substitute was not in the building, then you feel that you would rather not continue. And also, sets were built without any regard to the requirements of getting people in time musically on and off stage, and the people were not working in coordination, and general sloppiness.
In the era in which you grew up, the conductor was the dominating person, really, in the opera house, wasn't he?
I would perhaps say that when I started to be conscious of opera, it was the singers more than the conductor. Then came the period of the conductor's supremacy, and now I am afraid we have the producer as the protagonist.
Which way, right? Obviously, you think it should be the conductor.
Well, I can't help feeling it should be the conductor, but of course with a first-rate cast on stage, because the conductor alone, however good he is, cannot carry the whole thing. On the other hand, a fine conductor with just a good but not overwhelmingly first-rate cast on the basis of a well-rehearsed, integrated and planned performance can be of very much use to make you forget that the cast isn't really absolutely first-rate. On the other hand, if you have 4 first-rate singers and a complete zero or a harmful influence down in the pit, in the place of the conductor, the result will be equally or even more disappointing.
The producer has become more and more influential now. Do you think that most of the people who are actually working as producers in opera houses now, in your experience, have really no right to be there because of their lack of musical background?
I wouldn't go quite so far as to say that, although there are quite a number of this type active. But what's worse is that even those who have certain musical background sort of corroborate the bromide that a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. And that, furthermore, they are out to be different, to do something nobody else has done before, to the complete disregard of the directions of composer and librettist, and, what's worse, the disregard of the common sense.
What do you think about conductors who try to produce themselves?
If they can do it, it's a wonderful solution. Mahler did it, and there are some other examples of the recent past. It can work, but it is the exception if it does work. I think the ideal thing is a first-rate conductor with a first-rate producer who understand each other very well, who are very sympathetic and are flexible enough to adjust mutually, while the conductor, for obvious reasons, must have the last word if it's a problem that particularly interferes with the musical sequence of events.
One of the problems with opera today is that we have a handful of very famous stars, singers, tenors, sopranos, and so on, who rush about the world performing here, there, and everywhere, and who are disinclined, shall we say, to rehearse.
Exactly.
And this was a situation which I suppose did not exist at all at the time when you were with the Berlin State Opera, or indeed in Prague.
No. Actually, while I grew up in Vienna and was a pretty regular opera fan, we had a cast whose names I partly still remember that never moved out of Vienna. It was almost like a string quartet, always the same people, which made for a certain cohesion, that even a performance which was not the last word in preparation and being rehearsed had a sort of cohesion because these people were used to singing with each other. It was a team, and that's something you don't find very often these days. Later on in Berlin, it was very much the same thing. And even in my Prague days, we had sometimes one or the other distinguished guests coming into a completely integrated performance, which can absorb one guest very much more easily than the present system where you have 3 people coming from 3 different directions by jet plane. An hour or so before the performance, you can just tell them you enter here and you exit there.
And is this why you've yourself been, shall we say, not particularly interested in opera in the last few years? You couldn't put up with this system?
No, I couldn't put up with this system, and besides, I didn't happen to have enough time to devote to opera. I would have made the time, and I would have cheerfully accepted sacrifice of all sorts if I could have been sure that I could produce an opera performance for which I don't have to be ashamed.
But the standards you've set yourself in every field, in orchestral music, and indeed, I suppose, in the old days in opera, really, I don't think could possibly apply today, could they?
I am very much afraid that they couldn't, partly due to the fact that such impossibly high standards have been set by recordings of operas. I don't have to tell you how high standards have been accomplished, and these high standards cannot be or hardly be duplicated in the live opera theater. On the other hand, I am not really propagating the enjoyment of opera through recordings only to the detriment of the live performance, because in opera as well as in symphony and other performances, there is something which the best record will never be able to give, and this something is very difficult to describe. And if I may, I would like to mention a few facets of it. There's, in the first place, the community experience, if you know what I mean. The fact that you are in the same hall, in the same theater, with other people who have the same experience at the same moment when it just happens. And the other aspect is the, well, if you permit me to coin this ugly neologism, the onceness and unrepeatability of what just happens this moment, with its attendant dangers. This generates an excitement that cannot be generated by the very best recording, which, if you put it on twice in a row, will give you twice in a row the same thing. And that never happens in a live performance.
This is absolutely true. Of course, the only reason why one cannot assemble a cast of the sort you're talking about in the theater, well, is money.
Yes.
Money and time. Are you therefore gloomy about the future for opera as publicly performed?
It all depends what standards you set. If you set the highest standards overall, I am bound to be very gloomy, because there are far more opera houses now than there ever have been before, and I don't see a corresponding increase of talent, such as singers, conductors, and whatever goes to make an opera performance. So I cannot be too optimistic on the very highest level. On the other hand, I'm a little less pessimistic if you are willing to put up with a well-rehearsed, well-planned, well-staged, well-conducted performance of opera in which the ensemble value of what's going on stage outweighs the absence of star caliber cast. Do I make myself clear?
You do indeed. If you were invited and agreed to accept to conduct an opera, let us say at Covent Garden or the Metropolitan or Vienna or wherever else you like, and let's say it's a new production, how many rehearsals, orchestra rehearsals, would you imagine you'd ask for? Let's take a work at, let's say, Figaro.
Well, if I were to do Figaro in Vienna, orchestra alone rehearsals would be negligible. I mean, the orchestra knows it so well, always provided that I know who is sitting in the orchestra, because, you know, the Vienna Philharmonic, which sits in the pit, is now an orchestra of about 150 or 158, and it can be awfully good and it can be awfully bad according to who sits there. And one trick they like to play on a conductor, particularly on a conductor where they think that young people could learn something under his baton, is to put all the young and inexperienced people in there, which is perfectly all right, but in that case you need more rehearsals to teach them things which the old crew already is familiar with, although they may not play as freshly as the young people. So it's very difficult to give you a flat answer.
But you would agree, I think, that your own demands would probably be considerably more in terms of rehearsal than those of many other conductors around today.
I don't know whether my requirements would be that outlandish, because I know that certain new productions have adequate rehearsals. So I'm not extravagant in my demands, and I know how to utilize every minute of a rehearsal, and if I can work efficiently, I am not too keen at this stage of the game of wasting unnecessary minutes and hours at a rehearsal. But it all depends on the circumstances.
On this question of rehearsal, what sort of advice would you give to a young conductor about rehearsal technique? I know, for example, a lot of conductors, or some conductors, talk a lot in rehearsal. Others don't. I don't think you do.
No. I try to reduce my resorting to the spoken word to a minimum. And I always feel somehow humiliated if I cannot express by gesture, by facial expression, what I really want. If I have to go into verbal explanations, it is either that it's a question of subtle phrasing, inflection, balance, and so forth, or that I have failed to do it otherwise.
And it is a tendency, I imagine, among conductors right at the beginning to talk too much.
Yes, and there's another tendency of conductors to interrupt too often. And yet another tendency of conductors to conduct differently at rehearsals than at performances. Now, if you coast along at rehearsals, you cannot expect the orchestra to play with, or the singers, or whoever it is, with full participation. But if you start a rehearsal in the attitude that you are now conducting for keeps, to use an American slang expression, a performance, and you'll stop only if something goes wrong or if something is so contrary to your wishes, or if you cannot enforce by gesture and other non-verbal means your intentions, then you'll get the rehearsal right away into a different groove and on a higher level.
When you were a young man and you were preparing a work for rehearsal, whether an opera or a symphonic piece, what was your actual technique? How did you set about to learn the piece?
Well, I'm still of the old school of conductors who were taught to play it on the piano from the score. As a matter of fact, I was a specialist in that, and some special classes were set up for me at the Berlin Hochschule für Musik, which was the highest school, academy of music, which incidentally I still kept when I moved to Prague. I continued there twice a month between sleepers. That was the start of my homework. Whereas today, the young conductors learn their scores, not from the scores, but with due apologies to a former recording man, from the record. So what they learn, what they get into contact with, is not the work itself. It's the work seen through an interpreter. And I think this is very, very dangerous and very harmful, because these young people, and I could name a few, listen not to one record, but to 10 different records. But they never, and they listen to these records before they started the score, or they started the score while listening to the record, instead of first getting their own relationship to the work through knowledge of the score without the intermediary of another interpreter.
You have a scheme in Cleveland, I think, for young conductors who, if they pass certain tests,
Yes.
Are allowed to watch you at work and perhaps, am I right in saying, conduct some children's concerts?
Yes.
You, of course, have a reputation, if I may say so, as some sort of holy terror so far as this sort of thing goes. I know before I first met you and had to work with you in 1950, I was told all sorts of terrifying stories by all sorts of people about the demands you made.
Which I hope proved at least partially exaggerated.
At least partially exaggerated. But now I would like to know about these requirements that you make of these candidates who are coming to study with you in Cleveland. Clearly, you have to have a process of elimination, but what is it exactly that you make them do before they can join this scheme?
Well, I give them a test, and they got a mimeographed sheet before applying that these will be the entrance requirements. Among them is, first of all, I test to the best of my abilities their hearing and their sense of rhythm. Then I, in my old-fashioned way, require them to play something on the piano because I want them to have more than just a working knowledge of the piano. They should be pianists so they can take piano parts in the orchestra.
Is this a piece of your choice or theirs?
That will be of their choice, of their piano repertoire. Then I'll let them sight read something of my choice, both of the piano literature or some piano part of the orchestral literature. Then I'll test them how far their score reading ability goes, and I start very gently with Mozart and Haydn string quartets. Then I'll give them some Bach chorales in the old clefs. Then some a little more complicated scores. And finally, and this is also in the requirements, they will be required to conduct without an orchestra and from memory a movement of, say, Mozart or Beethoven or Brahms symphony of their own choice, humming the main melodic line and being prepared at every moment to be stopped and to be challenged to give an account of the orchestration at this particular moment. Of course, this seems a very stiff test, but it is not a rigid test, because very few will come through with ideal perfection. But it is a good test to see how far they will go.
And it eliminates the weak candidates almost
at once. It eliminates the impossible ones at once, while it is not necessarily indicative of the one ingredient which is so difficult to describe and which is so indispensable in a conductor, which you might call the power of communication or the power of suggestion, or this mysterious emanation of the personality which will force 100 other people to do one's bidding even against their own will and conviction, if there is any. So that is a little difficult to find out in this test, but it's very easy to find out the moment they really face an orchestra.
Indeed.
On the other hand, if I may add this, if I am faced with a choice of taking somebody who has this, shall we call it trivially, personal magnetism and a very questionable musical grounding, or on the other hand, a musically well-grounded person where this personality factor is in some doubt, I, for my purposes, will prefer the better grounded one. Now this, I admit, is a debatable choice, but each one can choose only after his own inclinations.
What about the element of showmanship?
What would you call the element of showmanship?
Well, the conductor is, of course, by one standard, a performer, is he not? He's performing in front of 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people. And this sort of personality projection which you were talking about, which in the musical sense has to be used in terms of the orchestra to convey his wishes to the orchestra, also sort of back projects, doesn't it, to the audience?
Unfortunately, it doesn't. I sometimes wish that some international police regulation would come out, putting all conductors for, say, the next 5 or 10 years behind a thin black silk screen, and you would experience the most amazing things in the judgment of audiences, also critics and what have you. Now, I feel certain that the showmanship, as far as it extends to the orchestra, and I wouldn't call it showmanship, that the gestures which serve to lead the orchestra, to signal the orchestra, to give the orchestra the necessary technical signals and also convey the mood are very important for the orchestra, but they are sometimes misleading if misapplied to the audience, because there are very many conductors, as I don't have to tell you, who do wonderful gestures, much admired by the audience, and you will find that even the more primitive type of orchestra musician will completely correctly say that this doesn't mean a darn thing to them.
So it's being done, of course, for the benefit of the audience.
Exactly, and this is something I disapprove of course.
I've been looking at the repertoire you've been playing in Cleveland. I mean, you yourself, as
Yes.
distinct from your guest conductors. Yes. Leaving out a few names like Prokofiev and Stravinsky, it is basically a 19th century repertoire that you have elected to play in Cleveland.
Well, yes, if you call Mozart, Haydn, and Bach 19th century. And
I was going by the majority of the names down. It happens to be the repertoire I like.
I'm so used to being called an old fogey and a reactionary. John, you really can't hurt me. I'm so used to it.
Not trying to. But what about contemporary music in your schedules?
I have done quite a bit of contemporary music, mostly American, but also other contemporary music. I have in my opera days done first performances of contemporary operas, some premieres, first performances. But in the course of my life and getting on in years, I became more intensive than extensive, and I found it more actually my task to do those works which I thought I'm best qualified to do, and for which a certain tradition is sort of disappearing with the disappearance of the great conductors who were my contemporaries and my idols, my unpaid teachers, if you will. This is one of the reasons.
Apropos unpaid teachers, which conductors really exercise the most profound influence on you?
Well, all conductors I ever heard, good, bad, and indifferent, exercised some influence, and even the negative influence of bad conductors is a very, and was and is a very valuable influence. But if you want to know the most commanding influences by conductors on my musical life, I would have to start with Arthur Nikisch, who was the great magician of the orchestra among the conductors. Then, of course, his successor, Furtwängler, Richard Strauss, Bruno Walter, Toscanini, Beecham, many. But the most commanding influences, I would perhaps say, were Nikisch and Toscanini. Now, these were two opposite poles, and yet somehow they were the strongest influences. Actually, I am doubtful whether Nikisch would be acknowledged the way he was at that time by post-Toscanini performance standards. And on the other hand, I feel that if he could be resuscitated and if you could hear a Nikisch performance, you would condone certain untidiness, certain imprecision, and you would be captivated by the incredible sound he created, how nobody will ever know, and by the warmth and the improvisational quality in his performances, something which went really out the window, definitely, or for the time being, with Toscanini. On the other hand, the transparency, the complete tidiness and the intensity, while non-chaotic, well, really Latin intensity of Toscanini, is also something which was of very great influence.
Was it a shock when you first heard Toscanini? I mean, after this background of Nikisch and people like that?
It was not a shock. It was a new world, and it was not altogether immediately completely convincing in all. It was incredibly admirable, but not altogether in all instances completely convincing. For instance, certain tempi were so contrary to the tradition in which I was brought up that I felt uncomfortable.
Not more than uncomfortable, because some people felt positively angry, I suppose.
Yes, it might be. So, well, I couldn't feel positively angry because my sense of admiration was too strong for that.
And you mentioned Beecham, who again was another completely different sort of conductor.
Yes, he was completely different, but in many ways very lovable, although I am bound to condemn many things he did to certain works.
Such as what?
Some uncalled for tempo modifications or some very mannered, over-pointed things. I will illustrate that. He played a Mozart concerto with Schnabel. And all of a sudden, in one of the performances, he did something which shocked Schnabel, and afterwards he said to him, Sir Thomas, why did you slow down on this spot? And Sir Thomas answered, just a whim.